They advanced with confidence through the Surigao Strait, believing there was still a chance to change the course of the war on that dark October night in 1944. Yamashiro pressed forward, Mogami close behind, unaware that every move had been anticipated hours earlier. This was not confusion. It was not luck. It was a perfect funnel. Ahead, silence. Around them, shadows. And then, without warning, the sea erupted in light. American battleships opened crossfire from both sides, turning momentum into a death sentence. With every passing minute, escape became impossible. They were not breaking an enemy line. They were entering a corridor with no exit. That night didn't just decide the fate of two ships. It marked the end of an entire era of naval warfare. Before we dive into the explosive details of how Yamashiro and Mogami met their fate at Surigao Strait, let me ask you something real quick. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments. I truly want to know. And if this story of American naval power is already pulling you in, hit that like button. It tells YouTube you want more true military history like this. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the moment. Turn on notifications because the battles ahead only get heavier. All right, let's go back to that night in 1944. The night over Surigao Strait was pitch black, heavy and deceptively calm. There was no moonlight cutting across the water, no visible horizon, just darkness, broken occasionally by the slow movement of steel through the narrow passage. Deep inside that darkness, the Japanese southern force pushed forward, convinced that speed, surprise, and courage could still change the course of a collapsing war. At the center of that formation sailed Yamashiro, a battleship stretching over 700 feet long, displacing more than 30,000 tons of steel, armed with 12 14-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing over 1,400 pounds each. Close behind came Mogami, a heavy cruiser fast, aggressive, and scarred by years of relentless combat. They believed they were slipping through a gap. They believed the American fleet was scattered. They believed the night belonged to them. They were wrong. What Yamashiro and Mogami could not see was not a fleet, but a wall. A silent line of American battleships and cruisers lay motionless across the northern end of the strait, engines barely turning, guns already trained. These were not the same ships Japan had faced earlier in the war. These were veterans, ships rebuilt, refitted, and modernized after Pearl Harbor. Ships equipped with radar systems that could see through darkness, rain, and smoke with chilling precision. Targets appeared on glowing green scopes long before any human eye could detect them. At nearly 40,000 yards, the first contacts were confirmed. Bearings locked, speeds calculated, courses predicted. Every movement of the Japanese force was being tracked in real time, second by second, as if the darkness itself had betrayed them. On Yamashiro's bridge, visibility was nearly zero. Lookouts strained their eyes into black nothingness. The sea felt too quiet, too empty. There was no sign of the enemy, no muzzle flashes, no silhouettes, just the steady thrum of engines and the belief that they were still unseen. Then the American destroyers struck. Torpedoes cut through the water at nearly 50 knots, each one carrying warheads weighing more than 600 pounds of high explosive. They were launched from invisible positions, their wakes lost in the darkness. Minutes later, the sea erupted. A massive explosion tore into Yamashiro's flank, followed by another. The battleship shuddered violently. Power fluctuated. Compartments flooded. The formation began to break apart as confusion spread across the Japanese line. Still, Yamashiro pushed forward. Mogami followed, weaving through smoke and fire, attempting to maintain speed while avoiding debris and burning oil spreading across the surface. Her 8-inch guns scanned uselessly into the night, firing blindly toward muzzle flashes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Every shell felt like a guess. Every maneuver felt delayed. And then, from the darkness ahead, the American battleships opened fire. The first salvos did not roar, they slammed. 16-inch guns, firing shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds, punched through the night with mathematical precision. Each shell traveled faster than the speed of sound, descending from the sky at angles designed to penetrate armor decks rather than sides. The water around Yamashiro exploded upward in towering white columns, some higher than a 10-story building. Seconds later, steel met steel. One shell struck forward, ripping through armor that had once been considered impenetrable. Another detonated near the aft turrets, twisting metal and knocking gun crews off their feet. The battleship's speed dropped sharply. Fires spread. Communications failed. The bridge shook as if the ship itself were breaking apart. Mogami tried to turn away. As she maneuvered, she collided with another Japanese cruiser in the chaos, crushing her bow and crippling her ability to fight effectively. Smoke poured into the night sky, illuminated by gunfire that never seemed to stop. Radar-guided salvos kept coming, perfectly timed, perfectly spaced. There was no escape route, no blind spot, no darkness left to hide in. By the time Yamashiro attempted her final turn south, she was already doomed. Multiple torpedo hits and relentless shelling had reduced her to a burning, flooding wreck. One last violent explosion ripped through her hull. Slowly, almost silently, the massive battleship rolled and slipped beneath the surface, taking hundreds of sailors with her into the black water below. Mogami survived the night, but not the battle. Her engines damaged, her hull shattered. She limped away at dawn, only to be hunted down hours later by aircraft. Bombs weighing 1,000 pounds fell from the sky, tearing through decks already weakened by fire and impact. With no hope of repair, she was abandoned and scuttled by her own crew. The battle was over, but the full meaning of what had happened that night was only beginning to sink in. What happened at Surigao Strait was not chaos, it was control, and that control came from something the Japanese Navy never truly adapted to: radar-directed warfare. As Yamashiro sank beneath the dark water, the American battle line never broke formation. Battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor now stood silent and dominant, their guns still trained north, waiting for threats that would never come. The crossing of the T had been executed flawlessly. Every Japanese ship that entered the strait had sailed directly into overlapping fields of fire, where maneuver meant nothing and bravery offered no protection. Mogami's escape attempt was already doomed the moment daylight arrived. At first light, American aircraft appeared overhead, engines humming with methodical calm. These were carrier-based dive bombers and fighters, machines built specifically to finish what surface guns had started. Planes like the SB-2C Helldiver dove from altitude, releasing bombs weighing up to 1,000 pounds. Each bomb carried enough explosive force to rip through multiple steel decks before detonating deep inside a ship's interior. Mogami was already bleeding smoke. Her hull was twisted, her superstructure scorched, her forward sections crushed from collision. Damage control teams worked frantically, sealing compartments, rerouting power, dragging wounded sailors through corridors filled with smoke and heat. But the ship was slowing. Fires were spreading. Steering was unreliable. The first bomb struck with brutal accuracy. Explosions tore open her deck, igniting fuel and ammunition. Shockwaves echoed through the hull, snapping pipes, rupturing cables, and throwing crewmen against bulkheads. Secondary explosions followed as stored shells detonated. Flames climbed higher. Black smoke poured into the sky, marking her position for every pilot above. Within hours, Mogami was no longer a fighting ship. She was a floating inferno. Her captain made the only decision left: abandon ship. Explosive charges were set. Survivors gathered on deck as the order was given. Moments later, Mogami was scuttled by her own crew, slipping beneath the surface in a violent roar of steam and fire. One of the most advanced cruisers Japan had ever built was gone. Surigao Strait was finished, and with it ended something far bigger than two ships. It was the last time in history that battleships fought battleships in direct combat. The final chapter of an era where massive guns, thick armor, and line-of-battle tactics decided the fate of fleets. After that night, the future of naval warfare was no longer in doubt. Radar, coordination, air power, and precision had replaced brute force and tradition. For the United States Navy, Surigao Strait was not just a victory, it was proof. Proof that the lessons of Pearl Harbor had been learned. Proof that technology, discipline, and preparation could turn darkness into an advantage. Proof that even the strongest steel could be undone when it sailed blindly into a prepared enemy. For Yamashiro and Mogami there was no second chance, no dramatic escape, no reversal of fate, only silence beneath the waves where their stories ended, frozen forever in the depths of a narrow strait. But the echoes of that night would shape naval doctrine for generations, and the men who stood behind those guns would never forget the moment the sea itself seemed to obey their command. By the time the smoke cleared over Surigao Strait, the American commanders already understood what they had just witnessed. This was not simply a victory, it was a demonstration of dominance built on preparation, patience, and technology. Every element of the battle had unfolded exactly as planned, down to the timing of each salvo and the placement of every ship in the line. The Japanese Southern Force never had a real chance to fight on equal terms. Radar had rewritten the rules. American fire control systems calculated range, speed, and bearing continuously, adjusting solutions faster than human operators ever could. While Japanese gunners relied on visual cues and flashes in the dark, American battleships fired with cold accuracy, shells landing within tight patterns that walked across their targets with devastating effect. Each 16-inch shell weighed nearly 2,700 pounds. Inside each one was an explosive charge designed to detonate after penetrating armor, not on impact. When those shells struck, they did not simply damage ships, they dismantled them from the inside out. Bulkheads collapsed, turrets jammed, ammunition hoists failed. Entire sections of steel ceased to exist. Yamashiro absorbed punishment no battleship was ever meant to endure. Multiple torpedo hits had already compromised her stability, flooding compartments and robbing her of speed. Shell impacts compounded the damage, opening her hull and igniting fires that burned uncontrollably. As power failed, gun crews fought in darkness, smoke, and heat, continuing to load and fire until orders could no longer reach them. There was no dramatic final stand, no last charge, just gradual, irreversible failure. Mogami's fate was no less brutal. Though faster and more maneuverable, she had been designed for a style of warfare that no longer existed. Her armor was lighter, her protection thinner. Once she collided during the retreat, her vulnerability became fatal. The damage slowed her enough for American aircraft to find her with ease. From the air, she was an unmistakable target, trailing smoke across the open sea. Bombs fell with surgical precision. Each impact peeled back steel, exposing internal compartments to fire and water. The heat became unbearable. The noise was constant. Survivors later described the sensation as the ship screaming while it died. When the scuttling charges detonated, it was not an act of surrender. It was mercy. Surigao Strait marked the collapse of Japan's southern approach to Leyte. Without those ships, the larger operation unraveled. American forces secured the beaches, reinforced their positions, and tightened their control of the Philippines. What had begun as a desperate gamble ended as a catastrophic loss. But beyond strategy and territory, the battle carried a deeper meaning. This was the end of the battleship as the king of naval warfare. For decades, naval power had been measured by the thickness of armor and the size of guns. At Surigao, those measurements no longer mattered. What mattered was information, detection, coordination, the ability to strike first without being seen. The ocean had not changed, the ships had, and the men aboard the American battle line understood it instantly. They had fought not with instinct, but with systems, not with bravado but with discipline, not with chance but with certainty. The Japanese ships sailed into history's closing door. The Americans closed it. In the hours that followed the destruction of Yamashiro and Mogami, the scale of what had happened became impossible to ignore. Reports flowed in across the American fleet, each one confirming the same conclusion. The southern Japanese force had been erased, not delayed, not repelled, eliminated. For the sailors aboard the American battleships, there was no celebration, just silence. Gun barrels still hot, shell casings scattered across steel decks, the smell of cordite lingering in the air. Men leaned against railings, staring into the distance where fires still burned on the horizon, knowing they had just participated in something that would never happen again. Surigao Strait had become a proving ground. The American battle line had consisted largely of ships once thought obsolete, battleships designed before the war, damaged at Pearl Harbor, written off by many as relics. Yet here they were, rebuilt with reinforced armor, upgraded fire control systems, and radar sets capable of tracking targets beyond visual range. Old hulls, new eyes. The Japanese ships never understood what they were facing. Yamashiro's armor had been engineered to withstand surface gunfire at known ranges. It had never been designed to survive radar-directed salvos raining down with near-perfect accuracy. Her defensive systems were overwhelmed not by superior numbers, but by superior awareness. She was fighting an enemy she could not see, predict, or respond to in time. Mogami's experience exposed an even harsher truth. Speed and maneuverability meant nothing when the sky belonged to the enemy. Once daylight revealed her position, her fate was sealed. American pilots approached methodically, lining up attacks without resistance. Anti-aircraft fire sputtered and faded. Damage compounded faster than repairs could be made. What remained was inevitability. Surigao Strait was not chaos. It was sequence. Destroyers crippled, battleships finished. Aircraft erased the survivors. Every step followed a logic refined through years of brutal learning, and the implications were immediate. Across naval command centers, analysts recognized that the era of surface duels was ending. Battleships could no longer operate independently. Darkness no longer offered protection. Surprise no longer favored the bold, but the prepared. Technology had shifted the balance permanently. For Japan, the loss went beyond ships. Experienced crews were gone. Hard-earned combat knowledge vanished with them beneath the waves. The psychological impact rippled through the remaining fleet. Confidence collapsed. Caution replaced aggression. The Southern force had gambled everything on one night and lost it all. For the United States, Surigao Strait became a symbol, not of revenge, not of destruction, but of transformation. A navy that once relied on visual range and instinct had evolved into a precision instrument, a force capable of turning darkness into advantage, a fleet that no longer reacted, but controlled. The sea had chosen a side, and the decision was final. As the final reports were compiled and the last fires faded into smoke, Surigao Strait settled into an uneasy calm. The water closed over wreckage, oil spread in dark stains across the surface, and the silence returned. But the sea was no longer the same. Too much steel rested beneath it now, too many lives, too much history. For the American fleet, the battle had confirmed something that could no longer be debated. Naval warfare had crossed a threshold. The battleships that fired that night did not win because they were bigger or stronger. They won because they saw first, calculated faster, and struck with intention rather than instinct. Each ship in the battle line had played its role with discipline. Fire orders were executed without hesitation. Salvos were timed, corrected, and repeated with mechanical precision. There was no rush, no panic, just controlled violence applied exactly where it mattered most. The Japanese ships never broke through because they were never meant to. Surigao Strait was a narrow funnel, and every decision made hours earlier had shaped what happened next. The placement of destroyers, the angle of approach, the silent patience of battleships holding their fire until the moment guaranteed maximum effect. By the time Yamashiro realized the truth, there was no room left to maneuver. By the time Mogami tried to escape, the sky itself had turned hostile. This was not a battle decided by luck. It was decided long before the first shot. The men aboard those American ships understood it in ways history books never fully capture. They felt the weight of responsibility with every shell fired. They knew that every calculation, every radar contact, every order carried consequences that could not be undone. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy, and yet it was decisive. Surigao Strait closed the door on the Japanese Southern force and sealed the fate of the Leyte Gulf operation. It removed the last realistic threat to the American landings. It ensured supply lines would hold. It confirmed control of the Philippines would not be contested again at sea. But more than that, it marked the end of an age. Never again would battleships meet in the dark and decide the outcome of a war with gunfire alone. Never again would armor and caliber outweigh detection and coordination. The torch had passed, and nothing could bring it back. The ocean remembered, and history moved forward. Before we leave this story behind, there is one final truth that cannot be ignored. Battles like Surigao Strait were not won by machines alone. They were won by the men who designed them, maintained them, trusted them, and stood their ground behind steel walls while the sea burned around them. Sailors who loaded shells in unbearable heat, engineers who kept engines alive under damage, pilots who finished what the guns began. Every ship, every system, every piece of equipment mattered. And above all, the people who served aboard them did. Their discipline, sacrifice, and resolve shaped the outcome of that night and countless others like it. To them, and to the ships that carried them into history, this story belongs.